This is a LSD trip report by Ted, posted to arrowwood.org on October 2nd, 2003. It was a freezing cold Friday night in November. The wind had ripped through the streets of the city and the sky was a dull, bruised gray. My two friends, the Wedge and Captain Teabag, and I had just moved into a house we called the Kappa Cappuccino House. The building was an old Victorian that had stood for more than 100 years. It had a narrow staircase, a creaking attic, and a roof that sloped sharply against the sky. The three of us felt that the house needed a ritual to mark our arrival, to baptize the walls, and to seal our friendship. We agreed that the ritual would be an acid trip. There would be no big party, no women, no music that would drown out the thoughts. Just the three of us, the old house, and a few hundred micrograms of lysergic acid diethylamide. I was not completely sure about the plan. The next day we were supposed to have a housewarming party for a crowd of strangers. I had already taken a dose of MDMA the night before, a legendary batch that had come all the way from Texas. That would be my first night on ecstasy. I kept my drug use under tight control. I smoked pot nightly at the time, but anything harder I treated as a special occasion. I was tentative about rolling for 2 nights in a row. The idea of an acid trip after a night of ecstasy felt like stepping into a storm without a coat. Our dealer arrived with the tablets. He was not the usual college girl who sold us the stuff in the past. He was a random man we had allowed to wander in off the street. He could have been a cop or a plumber. He told us that he had taken the same batch the night before and that it was really visual. That caught my attention. I had taken acid a few times before. The trips had been pleasant, but they had never produced the melting walls and Bruce Lee movie trails that many people described. I wanted to see something more vivid. We sat in the attic living room. The space was decorated with ultra-loungy deco furniture that the Wedge's dead uncle had bought in the 1950s with a lot of cash. The ceiling was a series of sharp angles, the opposite of the sloped roof outside, and it was covered with dozens of glow-in-the-dark stars. The stars glowed faintly under a single black light bulb that hung in the middle of the room. The furniture had been rearranged in a way that made the room feel both familiar and strange. The Wedge and Captain Teabag each had a chewable vitamin C tablet in their hand like candy. I had been doing a fast for 24 hours, a habit of mine when I wanted to be clean for a trip. I felt a little thin, a little jittery, but I was ready. The three of us looked at each other, and then the two friends lunged forward and forced the tablet into my mouth. Their hands held my arms at my sides and pressed the chalky tablet against my teeth. The moment my teeth sank into the dry tablet, I felt a sudden, sharp burst, as if a highly unstable naval orange had detonated inside my mouth. That was the exact second I know the trip began. The taste was bitter and metallic, and the sensation spread from my mouth down my throat like a wave of heat that was not hot, but more like a buzzing. My heart beat a little faster. My eyes widened as I tried to locate the source of the feeling. I looked around the attic. The black light painted the stars with a soft green glow. The furniture seemed to shift minutely, as if the wood were breathing. The 2 rooms on either side of the attic were playing different music. From Captain Teabag's room came a thumping house beat, a repetitive boom-shiz that made the floor vibrate. From the Wedge's room, a New Order track played, its bass line pulsing dun-dun-dun-dun-dun-dun-dun. I stood between the 2 doors, swaying slightly, trying to find a point of balance where I could hear both songs equally. When one song rose in my chest, the other faded into the background. I stayed there for what felt like half an hour, trying to locate an omega point, a calm in the middle of the storm. My mind began to wander. I thought about the house, about the fact that it was a 100-year-old building, about the fact that I was about to spend 2 nights in a state that most people only experience once a year. I thought about the fact that the 3 of us had never done anything like this before. I felt a mixture of excitement and fear. The fear was not the usual fear of a bad trip. It was a quiet anxiety about the unknown, about what the walls might reveal, about what my own thoughts might become. The feeling in my body intensified. I could feel the acid spreading through my bloodstream like a tide that was rising inside me. My skin tingled. The cold of the night outside seemed to retreat, replaced by a warm inner glow. The stars on the ceiling seemed to pulse in time with the music. The glow was no longer a faint green. It became a bright, almost liquid light that seemed to have its own texture. I could see the individual particles of light as if they were tiny fish swimming in a dark sea. I decided to explore the downstairs. I walked down the narrow staircase, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The house smelled of old wood, dust, and a faint hint of stale cigarettes. The hallway was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the black light from above. The doors to the 2 bedrooms were open. From the wedge room, the New Order bass continued to thrum. From Captain Teabag's room, the house beat kept a steady pulse. I could feel the vibrations in my chest, as if the music were a physical force pushing against me. I stood in the middle of the hallway, arms outstretched, trying to let the sound wash over me. The bass from New Order seemed to make the floor vibrate in a slow, steady rhythm. The house beat made the air feel thicker, like a low-frequency hum that you could feel in your bones. I tried to focus on the glow of the stars above. The stars were no longer static points. They seemed to ripple, to swirl, to form patterns that shifted with the music. A sudden movement caught my eye. The furniture in the attic had been rearranged while I was downstairs. The couch was now angled toward the window. The coffee table had been turned upside down. A lamp that had once stood in the corner was now on the floor, its shade broken. The change felt disorienting, like walking into a room that you had just left and finding that the walls had moved. I felt a wave of vertigo, as if the floor had tilted. The feeling of disorientation was amplified by the acid. I could almost hear the house sigh. I went back upstairs, hoping to find the wedge and Captain Tibet. The black light made the stars shine brighter, their green hue now a vivid turquoise that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The room felt both empty and full. I called out, but no answer came. I wondered if they had slipped out while I was messing with my audio. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Suddenly, from behind the couch, the wedge and Captain Teabag leapt out and tackled me to the ground. We all fell onto the shaggy carpet, laughing in a way that felt like children who had just discovered a secret. I shouted like a 3-year-old, "Do it again! Do it again! Do it again!" And they laughed even harder. The 3 of us rolled on the floor, the carpet brushing against our skin, the stars above us flickering like fireflies. After a few minutes, they helped me to my feet. I felt a strange betrayal. The one thing I had promised myself I would never do on acid was sit and watch a movie. Yet there, in the middle of the attic, they had set up a small television and were watching an old cartoon, An American Tale 2. Fivel Goes West. The wedge had gotten the tape from a McDonald's promotion. The screen glowed with bright colors that seemed to melt into each other. The cartoon showed a family of mice traveling on a raft through a maze of pipes, battling a cat named John Cleese, a cat named Dom DeLuise, and a dog named Jimmy Stewart. The characters moved in a way that was both familiar and strange, as if the animation had been stretched on a rubber sheet. I felt a surge of irritation. Dude, no, I am not going to waste this totally amazing, mind-altering experience on some stupid movie. I want a vision quest. I want to trip the light fantastic. The words came out of me with a force that surprised even me. I wanted to see something beyond the cartoon, beyond the walls, something that would take me farther than any music could. Captain Teabag, however, seemed unperturbed. He took a cigarette from a pack, lit it, and then lit 2 more, holding 3 cigarettes in his mouth at once. He placed one in my mouth, and the other 2 he held, one in each hand, and stood on the armrest of the couch. He began to dance, swinging his arms in wide arcs. The red tips of the burning tobacco traced glowing lines in the air, leaving temporary streaks of light that seemed to linger for a moment before disappearing. The motion of his dance made the room feel alive, as if the walls were breathing with each movement. The smoke curled upward, mixing with the green glow of the stars. The smoke itself seemed to take on color, turning a deep amber that blended with the turquoise of the stars. The air was thick with the scent of burning tobacco and the faint metallic tang of the acid in my bloodstream. The visual effect was intense. The stars on the ceiling swayed, as if they were being pulled by the movement of the smoke. They waxed and waned, shimmering back and forth like the reflection of a full moon on gently rolling water. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, trying to understand what I was seeing. The stars did not stop. They continued to pulse, each flicker synchronized with the beat of the house music that leaked from Captain Teabag's room. The New Order bass line from the Wedge's room added a low, steady hum that seemed to vibrate through my teeth. My eyes felt heavy, yet I could not look away. The visual field was a mixture of bright points, swirling smoke, and the flickering television screen. The captain sang along to the music, his voice raw and full of joy. He sang a Manchester acid house-style song by Primal Scream, mispronouncing the title as "Come Trip Inside This House." He swayed, his body moving in time with the rhythm, his shoulders lifting and dropping with each lyric. The music seemed to wrap around the room, a thick blanket of sound that pressed against my skin. I felt a laugh rise from deep inside me. It was a soft, breathy laugh that seemed to come from my throat and my belly at the same time. I laughed because the situation was absurd, because the colors were beautiful, because the world felt like it was opening a new door. I thought that if I could look at Captain Teabag and not tell him what I was seeing, but could somehow get him to understand that we were sharing the same vision, then perhaps we had moved into a quantum alternate reality where matter periodically shifted into a liquid state. I turned to him and said, "Dude, you see it, do not you? You see it." He flashed a wide grin that seemed to light up the room. He raised his hand and pointed to the opposite side of the couch. My eyes followed his finger. The point he indicated was a corner of the room where the black light met a shadowed wall. In that corner, a faint halo of light seemed to pulse, as if a small sun were rising behind a veil. The halo grew brighter, its edges becoming more defined. Turning, the halo grew brighter, its edges becoming more defined, turning into a perfect disk of light that seemed to pulse in time with the low thrum of the house music that the Wedge had left playing in the next room. I could feel the pressure in my chest rise as the light expanded, as if my heart were trying to match the rhythm of that invisible drum. The couch beneath me seemed to melt away, becoming a pool of warm liquid that supported my body but did not hold it. I could see the fibers of the upholstery stretch and flow like water, and the wood of the floorboards turned a deep amber, as if it were being heated from within. Captain Teabag laughed, a sound that rang like a bell, and his eyes were wide with the same strange glow that filled the corner of the room. He lifted his hand again, this time pointing toward the ceiling where the glow and the dark stars were beginning to swirl. The stars did not stay still. They rotated in slow circles, each one leaving a faint trail of light that lingered for a moment before fading. It was as if the ceiling itself were a galaxy, and we were floating inside it, looking out at the endless night. I tried to speak, but my mouth felt heavy, as if filled with honey. The words that came out were slow and deliberate. "It feels like the walls are breathing," I said. The captain nodded, his grin widening. He raised his other hand, and a thin line of light shot from his fingertip to the far wall, tracing a path that seemed to carve a new shape in the air. The line glowed bright for a heartbeat, then dissolved into a spray of tiny sparks that settled on the floor like dust. The floor began to ripple, each ripple a wave of color that moved outward from the point where the light had touched. The colors were not the usual reds and blues of a rainbow, but deeper, more saturated tones that I could not name. They seemed to have weight, as if I could reach out and touch them, and they would pull my fingers into a soft, cool embrace. I reached out, and my hand passed through the wave, feeling a sensation like cold water on my skin, yet also like warm sunlight on my face. The peak of the experience arrived in a sudden burst of sound and color. The music from the Wedge's room rose in volume, the bass thumping like a giant heartbeat, while the captain's house beats mixed with it, creating a complex rhythm that filled every corner of the attic. The lights on the ceiling spun faster, the stars becoming streaks, the streaks turning into ribbons that wrapped around the room. The ribbons twisted and intertwined, forming patterns that resembled ancient symbols, yet they were also completely new, as if they were being invented in that instant. I felt my body dissolve into the patterns. My arms were no longer separate from the couch. They were part of the ribbons, moving in time with the music. My thoughts were not thoughts at all, but a series of images that flashed one after another. A river of liquid glass, a field of tall grass that swayed without wind, a city made of glass that reflected the stars. Each image was vivid, each one lasting only a second, yet together they formed a story that I could not put into words. The captain stood beside me, his silhouette a dark outline against the swirling light. He lifted his head and shouted a word that I could not hear, but the feeling of his voice resonated in my chest. It was a sound of pure joy, a laugh that seemed to echo through the entire house. I laughed with him, a sound that came from deep inside, not from my throat. The laughter blended with the music, creating a harmony that felt like the universe itself was singing. For a few minutes the intensity held. The colors did not fade, the music did not drop, the light did not dim. It was as if time had been stretched into a thin sheet, and we were walking across it, each step a careful placement of foot and mind. I felt a sense of completeness, as if every part of me, the body, the mind, the spirit, had finally aligned with something larger. The feeling was not overwhelming in a scary way. It was gentle, like a warm hand holding mine. Then the plateau began. The swirling ribbons slowed, turning into gentle spirals that floated lazily in the air. The stars on the ceiling returned to their original positions, each one a small point of light that pulsed softly. The music softened, the bass becoming a low hum that resonated in my bones. I could feel my breathing become deeper, more even. My heart rate settled to a steady beat, and the pressure in my chest eased. I opened my eyes fully now and saw the captain's face clearly. He looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and affection, as if he were seeing me for the first time. He reached out and placed his hand on my shoulder. The touch was cool, grounding, and it seemed to pull me back toward the physical world without taking away the wonder that still lingered. Around us, the room was still filled with the faint glow of the halo, now a soft, steady circle that hovered above the couch. The floor was no longer rippling, but the wood still held a faint amber hue, as if it had been warmed by an invisible fire. The couch, once a pool of liquid, had solidified again, its cushions firm under my weight. I could feel the texture of the fabric, the slight give of the springs, the weight of the wood frame beneath. The wedge entered the attic, carrying a steaming mug of coffee. He set it on the small table beside the couch and took a seat opposite us. He looked at me with a grin that said, "You have seen something." He raised his mug and said, "To the trip." I raised my own mug, which was now filled with water that seemed to glow faintly, and said, "To the vision." The captain took a drag from a cigarette he had lit earlier, the ember glowing bright in the dim light. He inhaled, held the smoke for a moment, and then exhaled, sending a thin stream of gray into the air. The smoke swirled around the halo, briefly obscuring it, then dispersed, leaving the light unchanged. He smiled at me and said, "It is over, but it is not finished." His words were simple, yet they carried the weight of everything we had just experienced. We sat in silence for a while, each of us feeling the afterglow of the peak. The music continued at a low volume, a soft background that seemed to breathe with the room. I could feel my thoughts returning to their usual pace, but they carried a new clarity. Simple things that had seemed trivial before now felt important. The texture of the couch, the taste of the coffee, the smell of the cigarette smoke, the sound of the ceiling fan turning slowly above us. The come-down was gentle. I felt a slight heaviness in my limbs, as if my body wanted to settle into the couch and stay there. My mind, however, was still active, replaying fragments of the visions in a loop. I tried to focus on the present, on the feeling of the coffee warming my throat, on the way the light from the halo painted the walls in soft gold. I noticed that the halo itself was now a steady, quiet presence, not a pulsing beacon, but a calm eye watching over the room. As the minutes passed, the colors in my mind began to fade. The river of glass, the field of grass, the glass city, they all receded, leaving behind a sense of peace. I felt my breath slow further, each inhale filling my lungs fully, each exhale releasing any lingering tension. The captain's hand remained on my shoulder, a reminder that I was still anchored in the room. The wedge finished his coffee and stood, stretching his arms above his head. He looked at me and said, "You ready to go to bed?" I nodded, feeling a gentle fatigue settle over me. I stood slowly, feeling the wood of the floor beneath my feet, the slight give of the carpet, the coolness of the night air that seeped in through the open window. We walked down the narrow hallway to the bedroom. The hallway lights were dim, the glow in the dark stars on the ceiling of the attic still faintly visible through the open door. I could still hear the soft hum of the music in the background, a low drone that seemed to linger in the walls. I closed the door behind us, and the world felt smaller, more contained. Lying on the bed, I felt the mattress conform to my body, the sheets cool against my skin. The room was dark, but the faint glow from the hallway seeped in, casting a soft outline on the walls. I lay there, eyes open, watching the shadows shift as the wind moved the curtains. My mind was quiet, but the memory of the halo remained, a small disk of light that I could summon in my mind at will. The after effects of the trip lingered for several hours. My senses were heightened. The sound of the wind outside felt like a whisper directly into my ear. The taste of the coffee lingered on my tongue, sweet and slightly bitter. The smell of the cigarette smoke clung to my clothes, a reminder of the night's events. My skin felt slightly tingling, as if a gentle current ran just under the surface. I found myself thinking about the images I had seen. The river of glass, for example, seemed to represent a flow of thought that was clear and unimpeded. I wondered if I could bring that clarity into my daily life, if I could let my thoughts run smooth like water instead of getting tangled. The field of grass, swaying without wind, made me consider the idea of movement without external force, a kind of inner push that keeps one alive. The glass city, reflecting the stars, felt like a metaphor for how we construct our lives, fragile yet beautiful, always reflecting something larger than ourselves. I also thought about the captain's words, "It is over, but it is not finished." At the time they had sounded like a simple statement, but now they felt like a lesson. The trip had ended, the peak had passed, but the impact remained. The experience had opened a door in my mind, and even though the door had closed, the hallway beyond it was still there, waiting for me to walk through again when the time was right. The next morning I woke with a light headache, a dull throb at the base of my skull. It was not painful, just a reminder that my body had been through something intense. I stretched, feeling my muscles loosen, and walked to the kitchen where the wedge was already making a pot of coffee. He greeted me with a smile and handed me a fresh mug. The coffee smelled strong, and I could taste the bitterness immediately. It was comforting, grounding me back into the ordinary world. I spent the day moving around the house, cleaning up the remnants of the night. The couch, now back to its ordinary shape, still held a faint imprint where the halo had hovered. I noticed that the glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling seemed brighter than before, as if they had been charged by the night's energy. I sat on the couch for a while, watching the stars flicker, and felt a quiet joy that was not tied to any particular thought, just a feeling of being present. Later that evening, I met with the wedge and the captain on the porch, the cold November air biting at our faces. We talked about the trip in a low voice, each of us sharing what we remembered. The wedge talked about the coffee, how it seemed to smooth his nerves, and how the taste lingered longer than usual. The captain spoke about the cigarettes, how the smoke felt like a visual extension of the thoughts he had. I spoke about the halo, the ribbons, the river of glass, and the feeling of my body melting into the patterns. We all agreed that the night had been a rare moment of shared perception, something that would stay with us for a long time. In the weeks that followed, I found myself returning to the images in my mind. When I walked through the city, I would notice the glass of the windows and think of the glass city I had seen. When I sat in a quiet park, I would watch the grass sway and recall the field that moved without wind. When I listened to music, especially the house beats that had been playing in the attic, I would feel a subtle pulse in my chest, a reminder of the rhythm that had carried us through the peak. The integration of the experience was not immediate. There were moments when I felt disoriented, as if the ordinary world did not quite fit the new perspective I had gained. I sometimes caught myself looking for the halo in the corners of rooms, or trying to see the ribbons and the patterns of light on the walls. Over time, however, those moments became less frequent, and the lessons from the night settled into a quiet part of me.